All right, Rose for Emily by William Faulkner. This is in your backpack textbook. It starts on page 32. Also, in your lesson, I've provided you with a William Faulkner biography. It's pretty interesting, so you guys have a look at it. So let's start reading. Page 33. Actually, let me see something first. Yeah, we're going to read now. Page 33. When Miss Emily Grierson died, our whole town went to her funeral. The men threw a sort of respectful affection for a fallen monument, and the women mostly out of curiosity to see the inside of her house, which no one save an old manservant, a combined gardener and cook, had seen in at least 10 years. So, right off the bat, our main character is dead. The end. No, it's not the end. It's totally the beginning. But you get from this description the idea that she's a fallen monument, that Miss Emily Grierson was something to be respected in the town. Also, one of the things that I really enjoy about William Faulkner is he really sort of crawls into the minds, sort of the inner workings of men and women, but he does a really good job with women, especially the idea that these women only came to her home just to see inside of it. Right. And also we learned that there's a manservant. Now, Faulkner, of course, he is a Southern writer. And this story was written in 1930. So there's actually 1931, but there's going to be a lot of racist language that we typically do not use today. But the manservant's name is Toby. So generally when I read this aloud in class or even here, I'll substitute those words for Toby, things like that, just because it makes me more comfortable. So you'll hear that as we go through the story as well. So we've now been introduced to Miss Emily, so let us continue. It was a big squarish frame house that had once been white, decorated with cupolas and spires and scrolled balconies in the heavily lightsome style of the 70s, set on what had once been our most select streets. So we have this beautiful home, and it had once been white. So as we look at it now in the present, you can tell that it was once beautiful. When we get the term August streets, we know that this was at one point one of the more popular streets where the nice houses are, where the rich people lived. Or actually Select Street, sorry, not August. We'll get to August in a minute, but more of the Select Streets. But garages and cotton gins had encroached and obliterated even the August names of that neighborhood. Only Miss Emily's house was left, lifting its stubborn and coquettish decay above the cotton wagons and the gasoline pumps, an eyesore among eyesores. And now Miss Emily had gone to join the representatives of those august names where they lay in the cedar-bemused cemetery among the ranked and anonymous graves of Union and Confederate soldiers who fell at the Battle of Jefferson. Now, I like this because it reminds me so much of that movie Up. Have you seen the movie Up, where the little man, you see his little house in the middle of town and things just continue to grow around it, and just his little house is sort of preserved in time, like in a little bubble. That's kind of how I imagine Miss Emily Grierson's home being, with things changing and happening around her, but her living in that kind of little bubble. Alive, Miss Emily had been a tradition, a duty, and a care, a sort of hereditary obligation upon the town, dating from that day in 1894 when Colonel Sotaris, the mayor, he who fathered the edict that no woman should appear on the streets without an apron, remitted her taxes. The dispensation dating from the death of her father on into perpetuity. Not that Miss Emily would have accepted charity. Colonel Sotaris invented an involved tale to the effect that Miss Emily's father had loaned money to the town, which the town, as a matter of business, preferred this way of repaying. Only a man of Colonel Sotaris's generation and thought could have invented it, and only a woman could have believed it. Well, that's incredibly sexist, but that's okay, because we're just going to go with it. remitted her taxes. What this means is that Colonel Sitaris edited that Miss Emily Grierson no longer needed to pay taxes after her father's death. Now, once her father dies, this whole paragraph here sort of alludes to the fact that after her father's death, Miss Emily doesn't have any money left, that perhaps something happened to the estate, and really the only thing she has left is this house and her name. So that's one way that the town kind of took care of her, because of the very first sentence we have, she was a tradition, a duty, and a care. So he did take care of her. Also, it's really interesting that because of her upbringing as a socialite, not really a socialite, but more of a rich girl, they couldn't just say, well, we've decided to remit your taxes since you're broke. They made up an elaborate story that, her father had owned the money, and that way there would be no shame in the charity of it all. So that's interesting. When the next generation, with its more modern ideas, became mayors and aldermen, this arrangement created some little dissatisfaction. On the first of the year, they mailed her a tax notice. February came, and there was no reply. They wrote her a formal letter asking her to call at the sheriff's office at her convenience. A week later, the mayor wrote her himself, offering to call or to send his car for her, and received in reply a note on paper of an archaic shape, in a thin flowing calligraphy in faded ink, to the effect that she no longer went out at all. The tax notice was also enclosed without comment. I love the description of even the ink that she writes with is faded, that she is so just sort of lost in the past that even her ink is old. The letterhead that she uses is archaic, so it's interesting. They called a special meeting of the Board of Aldermen. A deputation waited upon her, knocked at the door through which no visitor had passed since she ceased giving china painting lessons 8 or 10 years earlier. They were admitted by the old man into a dim hall from which a stairway mounted into still more shadow. It smelled of dust and disuse, a close, dank smell. Toby led them into the parlor. It was furnished in heavy leather-covered furniture. When the man opened the blinds of one window, they could see that the leather was cracked, and when they sat down, a faint dust rose sluggishly about their thighs, spinning with slow motes in the single sun ray. On a tarnished gilt easel before the fireplace stood a crayon portrait of Miss Emily's father. Now, we have all been in this house. We have all either visited some sweet little church lady or something, and you sit down on her couch, and the minute you do, you get this puff of like dust and oldness, right? So I love that description. And then also, you have this really depressing house, right? I mean, it's just completely, I'm bummed out. I don't want to go in there, and it smells funky, and it's just not a good time. But not only that, but then you have this crayon portrait of Miss Emily's father. And I just imagine him in my head kind of scowly, just looking down at you like, who are you? What are you doing in my house? So that's kind of, intimidating. They rose when she entered, a small, fat woman in black, with a thin gold chain descending to her waist and vanishing into her belt, leaning on an ebony cane with a tarnished gold head. Her skeleton was small and spare. Perhaps that was why what would have been merely plumpness in another was obesity in her. She looked bloated, like a body long submerged in motionless water and of that pallid hue. Her eyes, lost in the fatty ridges of her face, looked like 2 small pieces of coal pressed into a lump of dough as they moved from one face to another while the visitors stated their errand. She did not ask them to sit. She just stood in the door and listened quietly until the spokesman came to a stumbling halt. Then they could hear the invisible watch ticking at the end of the gold chain. Now, this is an important symbol, and we'll get back to this after we read through the story, and we'll see it in the Google Doc. But the fact that the gold chain is the only thing that they see, that they only know that the watch is present when they become silent and they hear it ticking. This is an important symbol because without it, they would not know that she had a watch, that time was passing for her, right? Because she's sort of transfixed in time, right? In the past. So it's kind of interesting. Her voice was dry and cold. I have no taxes in Jefferson. Colonel Sataris explained it to me. Perhaps one of you can gain access to the city records and satisfy yourselves. But we are the city authorities, Miss Emily. Didn't you get a notice from the sheriff signed by him? I received a paper, yes, Miss Emily said. Perhaps he considers himself the sheriff. I have no taxes in Jefferson. But there is nothing on the books to show that. You see, we must go by the See Colonel Sataris. I have no taxes in Jefferson. But Miss Emily, see Colonel Sataris. Colonel Sataris had been dead almost 10 years. I have no taxes in Jefferson. Toby, the man appeared, show these gentlemen out. So she vanquished them, horse and foot, just as she had vanquished their fathers 30 years before about the smell. That was 2 years after her father's death, and a short time after her sweetheart, the one we believed would marry her, had deserted her. After her father's death, she went out very little, and after her sweetheart went away, people hardly saw her at all. This is incredibly sad, right? So we wonder why Emily's all alone. And now we know why she didn't marry, why she didn't have children. So we're going to find that out in this portion of the story. A few of the ladies had the temerity to call, but were not received. And the only sign of life about the place was the man, a young man then, going in and out with a market basket. Well, just as if any man could keep a kitchen properly, the ladies said, so they were not surprised when the smell developed. It was another link between the gross, teeming world and the high and mighty Griersons. This is kind of neat, right? These women, all these little small-town women gossiping. And, I'm sure at one point in their life, they were probably pretty jealous of Emily Grierson. She had a ton of money and rich daddy, a nice house on a nice street, right? She was a big deal. And now the fact that her father's dead and she's living in poverty, well, this pleases them, right? So they're kind of nasty humans. A neighbor, a woman, complained to the mayor, Judge Stevens, 80 years old. Oh, well, what will you have me do about it, madam? He said. Why, send her word to stop it, the woman said. Isn't there a law? Well, I'm sure that won't be necessary, Judge Stevens said. It's probably just a snake or a rat that man of hers killed in the yard. I'll speak to him about it. The next day he received 2 more complaints, one from a man who came in definite deprecation. Oh, we really must do something about it, Judge. Look, I'd be the last one in the world to bother Miss Emily, but we've got to do something. That night the Board of Aldermen met. 3 gray beards and 1 younger man, a member of the rising generation. Well, it's simple enough, he said. Send her word to have her place cleaned up. Give her a certain time to do it in, and if she don't— Damn it, sir, Judge Stevens said. Will you accuse a lady to her face of smelling bad? I like that. So, the next night, after midnight, 4 men crossed Miss Emily's lawn and slunk about the house like burglars, sniffing along the base of the brickwork and at the cellar openings while one of them performed a regular sewing motion with his hand out of a sack slung from his shoulder. They broke open the cellar door and sprinkled lime there and in all the outbuildings. As they recrossed the lawn, a window that had been dark was lighted, and Miss Emily sat in it, the light behind her and her upright torso motionless as that of an idol. They crept quietly across the lawn and into the shadow of the locusts that lined the street. After a week or 2, the smell went away. Can you imagine if you had to have that job? Like, okay, guys, this is what we're going to do tonight. We're going to get all camoed up. We're going to get lime, and we're going to try to de-stinkify Miss Emily's house. So the ladies in the town will hush up about it. I do not want that job, and I sure don't want that job if, while I'm doing it, Miss Emily hits the lights and she's staring at me from a window upstairs. That's creepy, right? So anyway, that was when people had begun to really feel sorry for her. People in our town remembering how old Lady Wyatt, her great-aunt, had gone completely crazy at last, believed that the Griersons held themselves a little too high for what they really were. None of the young men were quite good enough for Miss Emily and such. We had long thought of them as a tableau. Miss Emily a slender figure in white in the background, and her father a spraddled silhouette in the foreground, his back to her and clutching a horsewhip, the two of them framed by the back-flung front door. So when she got to be 30 and was still single, we were not pleased exactly, but vindicated. Even with insanity in the family, she wouldn't have turned down all of her chances if they had really materialized. Well, this part's real sad. So the town has come to the conclusion that Miss Emily must be crazy. And of course, crazy runs in families, as they have stated in this paragraph. So they remember old Lady Wyatt, who was her great-aunt, and she went a little crazy. So they kind of expected Miss Emily to do the same. Now, not only that, but we get a really interesting sort of picture painted for us about Emily and her father. We see Emily behind her father in a white gown, hence symbolizing that she was young, and he's got a horsewhip. Now, if you are a young man coming to pick up Miss Emily, and you open the door to this scowling Southern man with a horsewhip, would you be inclined to take Miss Emily out on the town? No, you wouldn't. I wouldn't. So now we know why she never had any suitors or why she wasn't married, because her father kept all that away from her, right? When her father died, it got about that the house was all that was left to her. And in a way, people were glad. What a bunch of jerks. These people in this town they're really jerks. They're not nice. But it's also kind of honest, isn't it? That people are sort of like that. At last they could pity Miss Emily. Being left alone and a pauper, she'd become humanized. Now she too would know the old thrill and the old despair of a penny more or less. The day after his death, all the ladies prepared to call at the house and offer condolence and aid, as is our custom. Not because they were kind or it was Christian charity. No, they did it because it was customary to do so, right? So there's no kindness. There's no kindness in these actions. Miss Emily met them at the door, dressed as usual and with no trace of grief on her face. She told them that her father was not dead. She did that for 3 days with the ministers calling on her and the doctors trying to persuade her to let them dispose of the body. Just as they were about to resort to law and force, she broke down and they buried her father quickly. We did not say she was crazy then. We believed she had to do that. We remembered all the young men her father had driven away, and we knew that with nothing left, she would have to cling to that which robbed her, as people will. So no matter how dark or how twisted it was, her father was the only thing she had. So she wanted to hold on to it, right? Even though he took away any chance that she had to have a family of her own, children of her home, a husband of her own, because that was taken from her, her father was the only thing that she had. And so she wanted to keep it, right? So it's incredibly sad. It's incredibly dark. So it's tragic. So let's keep going. She was sick for a long time. When we saw her again, her hair was cut short, making her look like a girl, with a vague resemblance to those angels in colored church windows, sort of tragic and serene. The town had just let the contracts for paving the sidewalks, and in the summer after her father's death they began the work. The construction came with men and mules and machinery, and a foreman named Homer Barron, a Yankee, a big, dark, ruddy man with a big voice and eyes lighter than his face. The little boys would follow in groups to hear him cuss the men, and the men singing in time to the rise and fall of picks. Pretty soon he knew everybody in town. Whenever you heard a lot of laughing anywhere about the square, Homer Barron would be in the center of the group. Presently we began to see him and Miss Emily on Sunday afternoons, driving in the yellow-wheeled buggy and the matched team of bays from the livery stable. At first we were glad that Miss Emily would have an interest, because the ladies all said, well, of course a Grierson would not think seriously of a northerner, a day laborer. But there were still others, older people, who said that even grief could not cause a real lady to forget noblesse oblige, without calling it noblesse oblige. They just said, poor Emily, her kinsfolk should come to her. She had some kin in Alabama, but years ago her father had fallen out with them over the estate of the old Lady Wyatt, the crazy woman, and there was no communication between the two families. They had not even been represented at the funeral. So, we have this whole idea of noblesse oblige, which you'll look down as the obligation of a member of the nobility to behave with honor and dignity. Well, Miss Emily Grierson is Southern nobility, so she will not marry a Yankee. Heaven forbid, right? Scarlett can't marry a Yankee. We just can't have that. So, what is going to happen here is the ladies of the town are going to intervene, and they are going to call her relatives from Alabama. Now, anytime a lady got in trouble, the first person they would contact is other family members. Now, we learned that there is a rift between the family because Emily's side of the family was not represented at a funeral, so things are quite scandalous back then, all the little things that you had to do. So, let us continue. And as soon as the old people said, poor Emily, the whispering began. Do you suppose it's really so? They said to one another. Oh, of course it is. What else could? This behind their hands, rustling of crane silk and satin behind jalousies closed upon the sun of Sunday afternoon, as the thin, swift clop, clop, clop of the match team passed. Poor Emily. So we get a scene of her in Homer Barron's buggy, his horse-drawn buggy. And jalousies are the little windows, the little curtain things in the windows. Well, they were riding around town with those closed, and that was just not done. First of all, a woman of Emily's age would have needed a chaperone, and that obviously wasn't happening. Second of all, those window blinds should have definitely have been up, and they weren't, so it's quite scandalous. She carried her head high enough, even when we believed that she was fallen. It was as if she demanded more than ever the recognition of her dignity as the last Grierson, as if it had wanted that touch of earthiness to reaffirm her imperviousness. I like that line. Basically, that's just saying that she is intentionally acting scandalous because the town still has to respect her simply because of her name. So she's like, watch me do this. What are you going to do about it? So I kind of like that. It kind of sort of her way of telling them to, I can't think of anything that's not crude that I could say, but she's kind of giving them a little, have at you. So, let's start here. As if she had wanted that touch of earthiness to reaffirm her impervious. Like when she bought the rat poison, the arsenic. That was over a year after they had begun to say, poor Emily. And while the two female cousins were visiting her. Okay, so we've had a shift in time. So now we see her. She's got the two female cousins living in the house with her, and she's went to buy arsenic. Sorry, guys, my throat. I want some poison, she said to the druggist. She was over 30 then, still a slight woman, though thinner than usual, with cold, haughty black eyes and a face the flesh of which was strained across the temples and about the eye sockets as you imagine a lighthouse keeper's face ought to look. I want some poison, she said. Yes, Miss Emily, what kind? For rats and such? I'd recommend... I want the best you have. I don't care what kind." The druggist named several. "They'll kill anything up to an elephant, but what you want is arsenic," Miss Emily said. "Is that a good one?" "Is arsenic? Well, yes, ma'am, but what you want?" "I want arsenic." The druggist looked down at her. She looked back at him, erect, her face like a strained flag. "Why, of course," the druggist said, "if that's what you want, but the law requires you to tell what you were going to use it for." Miss Emily just stared at him, her head tilted back in order to look him eye for eye, until he looked away and went and got the arsenic and wrapped it up. I love that line. She stared him down, but what she actually did was stare him up because she is shorter than he is. But she was able to deflect him, even by staring up at him. I'm scared of Miss Emily, but I love this so much because I'm 4'11" myself, and I try to stare people down all the time. It's not very effective, so I'm going to take some lessons from Miss Emily. Maybe not all the lessons, but I don't want to give the story away. So the delivery boy brought her the package. The druggist didn't come back. When she opened the package at home, there was written on the box, under the skull and bones, "For rats." So the next day we all said she will kill herself, and it would be the best thing. Well, here's our sweet town people again, wishing the best for Miss Emily and all. They really hope she kills herself because it really would be the best thing for her to do. Isn't that dreadful? These people are horrible. When she had first begun to be seen with Homer Barron, we had said she will marry him. Then we said she will persuade him yet, because Homer himself had remarked he liked men, and it was known that he drank with the younger men in the Elks Club, that he was not a marrying man. Later we said, poor Emily behind the jalousies as they passed on Sunday afternoon in the glittering buggy. Miss Emily with her head high, and Homer Barron with his hat cocked and a cigar in his teeth, reins and whip and a yellow glove. Now, Faulkner did an interview about this section, about Homer not being a marrying man. Now, I think when we read this, especially in our day and age, because we're so sensitive to the whole movement of equal rights and that sort of thing, I think when we hear he's not a marrying man and that he liked men, we automatically think that he was homosexual, but he wasn't. Faulkner described Homer Barron in several interviews the fact that he was just not the type of man to be held down. He liked to gamble and drink, and he just wasn't the type of man that you could build a family with, which is what he meant at the time. So I wanted to clear that up because the first time I read it, I thought, oh, Homer, but it wasn't. He's just, So let's keep going. Then some of the ladies began to say that it was a disgrace to the town and a bad example to the young people. The men did not want to interfere, but at last the ladies forced the Baptist minister, Miss Emily's people were Episcopal, to call upon her. He would never divulge what happened during that interview, but he refused to go back again. The next Sunday they again drove about the streets, and the following day the minister's wife wrote to Miss Emily's relations in Alabama. So here's the third time that Miss Emily has vanquished somebody from her home. So we have the poor Baptist minister. She ripped the pharmacist a new one, and then she also took out the people who came to her house wanting their tax money. So she is a force to be reckoned with. Now, after that didn't work, then we finally have the letter sent for their relations to come from Alabama. So she had blood kin under her roof again, and we sat back to watch developments. At first nothing happened. Then we were sure that they were to be married. We learned that Miss Emily had been to the jeweler's and ordered a man's toilet set in silver with the letters HB on each piece. Now, I don't know if you guys are familiar with what a toilet set is, but it's like a brush and a comb and like a silver-plated mirror, and you can have monograms on it, something that people used to have back in the day. I didn't want you to think it was an actual toilet that she had monogrammed and brought into the house. Here you go, Homer. It's my wedding present. That would suck for a wedding present. 2 days later, we learned that she had bought a complete outfit of men's clothing, including a nightshirt, and we said, "Oh, they are married." We were really glad. We were glad because the 2 female cousins were even more Grierson than Miss Emily had ever been. So at first they didn't want her to marry Homer, and then they decided, well, she must be married, but that's not the worst thing that could happen. The worst thing that could happen is these terrible women from Alabama will stay in town any longer because they're dreadful. So these town people are very wishy-washy. So we were not surprised when Homer Barron, the streets had been finished some time since, was gone. We were a little disappointed that there was not a public blowing off, but we believed that he had gone on to prepare for Miss Emily's coming, or to give her a chance to get rid of the cousins. By that time it was a cabal, and we were all Miss Emily's allies to help circumvent the cousins. Sure enough, after another week they departed. And as we expected all along, within 3 days Homer Barron was back in town. A neighbor saw Toby admit him at the kitchen door at dusk one evening. And that was the last we saw of Homer Barron and of Miss Emily for some time. Toby went in and out with the market basket, but the front door remained closed. Now and then we would see her at a window for a moment, as the men did that night when they sprinkled the lime, but for almost 6 months she did not appear on the streets. Then we knew that this was to be expected too, as if that quality of her father which had thwarted her woman's life so many times had been too virulent and too furious to die. So what that means is her father keeping her from any type of relationship in her youth. I mean, Miss Emily couldn't develop a healthy relationship, right? There's no possible way she didn't have a mother. Evidently her relationship with her father was, I can't even imagine what it would be like to live with somebody who toted around a horsewhip and threatened to, kill anybody who tried to love his daughter. So I don't think Miss Emily was ever really able to perhaps nurture a real relationship or have any idea how to do that. So basically that's what that line means, that because of all of her past experiences, that there was no way that her and Homer could have had a healthy relationship. Alright, so when we next saw Miss Emily, she had grown fat, and her hair was turning gray. During the next few years it grew grayer and grayer until it attained an even pepper and salt iron gray when it ceased turning. Up to the day of her death at 74, it was still that vigorous iron gray, like the hair of an active man. From that time on, her front door remained closed, save for a period of 6 or 7 years when she was about 40, during which she gave lessons in china painting. She fitted up a studio in one of the downstairs rooms, where the daughters and granddaughters of Colonel Sitaris's contemporaries were sent to her with the same regularity and in the same spirit that they were sent to church on Sundays, with a 25-cent piece for the collection plate. Meanwhile, her taxes had been remitted. I feel sorry for these kids having to go into Miss Emily's house to take china painting lessons. And I love that Faulkner uses the analogy of going into Sunday school room and putting your money in the plate. Because I remember when I was little, I guess probably about the age of 13 and 14, I hated going to Sunday school. I was like, I just want to sleep. And they'd make me go, so I'd walk in all disgruntled. So imagine that's what these poor kids are doing. Then the newer generation became the backbone and the spirit of the town, and the painting pupils grew up and fell away and did not send their children to her with boxes of color and tedious pictures and cut from ladies' magazines. The front door closed upon the last one and remained closed for good. When the town got free postal delivery, Miss Emily alone refused to let them fasten the metal numbers above her door and attach a mailbox to it. She would not listen to them. Daily, monthly, yearly, we watched Toby grow grayer and more stooped, going in and out with the market basket. Each December we sent her a tax notice which would be returned by the post office a week later unclaimed. Now and then we would see her in one of the downstairs windows. She had evidently shut up the top floor of the house, like the carven torso of an idol in a niche, looking or not looking at us, we could never tell which. Thus she passed from generation to generation, dear, inescapable, impervious, tranquil, and perverse. And so she died. Fell ill in the house filled with dust and shadows, with only a doddering man to wait on her. We did not even know she was sick. We had long since given up trying to get any information from Toby. He talked to no one, probably not even to her, for his voice had grown harsh and rusty as if from disuse. I love that line. I just really think that's beautiful. She died in one of the downstairs rooms in a heavy walnut bed with a curtain, her gray head propped on a pillow yellow and moldy with age and lack of sunlight. Toby met the first of the ladies at the front door and let them in, with their hushed, sibilant voices and their quick, curious glances, and then he disappeared. He walked right through the house and out the back and was not seen again. The two female cousins came at once. They held the funeral on the second day, with the town coming to look at Miss Emily beneath a mass of bought flowers, with the crayon face of her father musing profoundly above the bier, and the ladies sibilant and macabre, and the very old men, some in their brushed Confederate uniforms, on the porch and the lawn, talking of Miss Emily as if she had been a contemporary of theirs, believing that they had danced with her and courted her, perhaps confusing time with its mathematical progression, as the old do, to whom all the past is not a diminishing road, but instead a huge meadow which no winter ever quite touches, divided from them now by the narrow bottleneck of the most recent decades of years. Ugh, that paragraph is breathtaking. So let's go through it together. So, back in the old times, they would have the body lay in state in the home. So Miss Emily is actually in her home. That's why we have the description of her father's crayon portrait staring down over the coffin. So that's just something that they used to do. And then from that point, we see all of these old men dressed up in their Confederate uniforms, and they're all standing around on the porch. And I can just imagine the conversations that they're having. They're like, well, you know, that old cotillion we had. Well, I remember Miss Emily was there. She was in that real pretty yellow dress. And I just thought to myself, I'm going to dance with Miss Emily, and we're just going to have a lovely time. And just remember, even if it didn't happen, right? Just sort of having those memories about her. And then it goes into this talk about how as we age, time is no longer a linear line. It's more of that once linear path sort of spreads out and becomes like a large round field. And it's hard because I think to myself, I graduated in 94, but it feels like it was maybe just like 10 years ago, but it wasn't. It was several years ago. And it seems like the things that are in the past weren't really that far away. So rather than it being down a stretch of road, it's just kind of, over to the left a bit, right? So it's kind of an interesting way to think about time. And I think we all do that as we age. So let's keep on. Already we knew that there was one room in the region above stairs which no one had seen in 40 years, and which would have to be forced. They waited until Miss Emily was decently in the ground before they opened it. That was neighborly, wasn't it? The violence of breaking down the door seemed to fill this room with pervading dust. A thin, acrid pall as of the tomb seemed to lie everywhere upon this room, decked and furnished as for a bridal. Upon the valance, curtains of faded rose color, upon the rose-shaded lights, upon the dressing table, upon the delicate array of crystal in the man's toilet things backed with tarnished silver. Silver so tarnished that the monogram was obscured. Among them lay collar and tie as if they had just been removed, which lifted left upon the surface a pale crescent in the dust. Upon a chair hung the suit, carefully folded, beneath it the two mute shoes and the discarded socks. The man himself lay in the bed. For a long while we just stood there, looking down at the profound and fleshless grin. The body had apparently once lain in the attitude of an embrace, but now the long sleep that outlasts love, that conquers even the grimace of love, had cuckolded him. What was left of him, rotted beneath what was left of the nightshirt, had become inextricable from the bed in which he lay, and upon him, and upon the pillow beside him, lay that even coating of the patient and biting dust. Then we noticed that in the second pillow was the indentation of a head. One of us lifted something from it, and leaning forward, that faint and invisible dust, dry and acrid in the nostrils, we saw a long strand of iron gray hair. OMG, right? We found Homer. He didn't go out of town, right? She kept him upstairs until he was like a little piece of Homer Barron beef jerky, right? So that's tragic. It's really tragic. So let's talk about this story in depth together. All right, so the genre of A Rose for Emily is Southern Gothic. Southern Gothic usually takes place in an interior space of sinister buildings. And we had that, didn't we, in Miss Emily's house? It was all creepy and dark and smelled musty, and the dust was floating around, and the leather was cracked, and all of this sorts of things. So we have a spooky house. Also, it thrives on cultivating an oppressively claustrophobic atmosphere, right? And we felt that. You didn't want to go in there. You didn't want to go in the Grierson's house. It was gross. So also elements, spooky houses, locked rooms. We had a locked room, right? It's the room Homer was in. So Southern Gothic. Generally, when we think Gothic, I think we all think Poe. The thing that makes it Southern is just the whole noblesse oblige, the fact that the men are walking around in Confederate uniforms at the end, just the whole, the culture, the Southern culture is there. So that's what makes it our Southern Gothic genre. Now, the style in the narrator, this was really, really interesting. If you'll notice, the person who told us the story is really an unnamed narrator, right? We know that they are a townsman because he knows an awful lot about Emily, doesn't he? He saw her when she was a child, with her, not really a child, but a young adult, as her father kept the suitors away from her. He's seen her entire life. So it's like he watches her, but he does kind of keep a respectful distance from her, except for that night that they sprinkled the lime, because he was there. If you'll go back and read the paragraphs, you can see that he was actually present at that, and I don't think that was very respectful, but you know. Tone and manner of our narrator. Our narrator is informed, but he's detached, right? So even when they found the body, he was like, and the man was under the, the man was on the bed. I mean, wow. That's all you got? Like, if I would have been narrated, I'd be like, and then on the sheets we found the body of Homer buried. Oh my gosh, it was gruesome, right? Like, you would have been a bit more expressive, but he was just like, and the man lay on the bed. That's crazy. Also, you'll notice that he mixes his own observations with town gossip, but he stays really neutral. Like, he's not like, yeah, she was totally crazy. He never uses words like that. He allows other people to say that she was crazy or she was whatever. Also, he uses we instead of I when he makes observations about Miss Emily, but those observations are always neutral. So, and he does that because we tend to believe him, don't we? Now, if he was just like, oh, Miss Emily's crazy, she's whack, she's a total nut job, we wouldn't believe him. We would be like, okay, well, she might be, but you might be biased for some reason. So it was easier for us as readers to take his word as truth because he was neutral. So let's start with Colonel Sitaris and Emily's unnamed father. Miss Emily's father, it's an interesting thing. He protects her from life, but it's also that delicate balance of where if you protect a child too much from life, then they cannot live on their own. And Miss Emily obviously cannot live on her own. She's whack-a-doodle, right? She's kind of Craytown. So, arguably, this doting, taking care of his daughter, not letting her have suitors, has made her entirely dependent on him. And once he passes, she doesn't know how to take care of herself. And then also we have another man in Emily's life who tends to take care of her, and that's Colonel Taurus, right? At this point, if you live in a home and somebody starts demanding taxes of you, you think to yourself, well, I'm going to have to pull up my bootstraps and get a job or figure out how I'm going to support myself. Well, Colonel Taurus steps in, and she doesn't have to do that. So not only have these two men protected her, but they have also harmed her simultaneously because she cannot care for herself, right? Then we have good old Homer. He was a Yankee, a day laborer. I imagine this is what Homer looks like. This guy kind of looks like Hitler, though, but not a marrying man. He's jovial, center of attention. Now, this is the thing that I would argue about Homer, because I find it extremely interesting that a man like Homer, who's happy and has a lot of friends and real go-lucky, why is he interested in Miss Emily? I think our perspective of Miss Emily is that she's this horrible, frightening freak, but something about Miss Emily attracted Homer enough to the point where he was riding around with her on Sundays. So I think he's kind of an interesting character because he gives us insight into a side of Miss Emily Grierson that we don't see as readers, right? Our point of view, the point of view that we're given, we really don't see that about Miss Emily. So I would be curious to see why Homer Barron was attracted to her. She obviously didn't have any money, so it couldn't have been for money. So I don't know. Something to think about, something to marinate on. And we have Miss Emily. She's an old school Southern belle. She's very accustomed to getting her way, and she got her way with Homer, right? She kept him forever. And it wasn't exactly the way that we would hope that she would want to keep someone she loved, but by gosh, she did it. She sure did. He wasn't going anywhere. So, she's obviously deadly. She's obviously deranged. And then I love this line about her. Generation to generation. Dear, inescapable, impervious, tranquil, and perverse. The whole perverse thing really didn't make sense until we reached the end of the story. So, I think that's interesting. It was a bit of foreshadowing. Speaking of foreshadowing, we really should have seen this coming. There were several elements to the story that foreshadowed the fact that Homer Barron was the smell. The thing that threw us was the chronological order of the story. Faulkner does not tell the story from beginning to end, does he? He starts at the end, and then he sort of messes with our timeline. So it kind of keeps us guessing, right? So, we had that he introduces the smell first off. And so we're like, oh, well, her house stinks. Well, she's a hoarder, right? We automatically think hoarder. But then she keeps her father. That's the next thing that happens. She keeps her father's dead body, which should have been a huge clue to us that she's rather fond of saving mementos. So we should have seen that coming. So that element was also a foreshadowing of what was to come. And then also the poison. She didn't buy the poison, but Faulkner sort of put us he kind of gave us a little detour when the women of the town were like, oh, she'll kill herself. And we're glad of it, right? Then we became so enraged that we sort of forgot about the fact that Miss Emily's toting around arsenic. So it kind of gave us sort of he showed us something sparkly on the other side of the room, and so we lost our focus. Symbols. The clock, we already talked about that a little bit. The watch, how, you had the watch chain, but then the watch you couldn't see it until you actually heard it. And that was kind of symbolic of Miss Emily being stuck in time. You know, she's really trapped in the past. And then also this beautiful house, you know, it's a mirror symbol of Miss Emily. You know, we had her standing in the background with her father in a white dress. And this house used to be white and pristine in its youth. And then it became old and gray, much like Miss Emily became old and gray. She refused to change with the times. Remember when they tried to put a little post office box on her door and she freaked out and was like, "No way, Jose, get off my property." Right? So even the house itself wasn't allowed to change and to grow, just like Miss Emily wasn't allowed to change and grow. So it's an important symbol. And then what about that rose, right? The story's called A Rose for Emily. And if you'll think about it, there wasn't a single rose in the entire story. So, sub rosa, the etymology. It first came from 1654. Sub rosa means under the rose. And it starts with Greek mythology. Aphrodite gave this rose to her son Eros, and in turn he gave it to Harpocrates, the god of silence, to ensure that his mother's indiscretions were kept under wraps, because you know those Greek gods just love to, love each other, even if they were married. So that was from Greek mythology. And then also in the Middle Ages, a rose suspended from the ceiling of a council chamber meant that everything that was spoken above or beneath that rose was to be kept secret and never to leave that room. So like King Arthur, all of that, they always had the rose. Now, with that in mind, if you will think about it, when they opened the door, when they knocked down the door that Homer Barron, the room that he was actually in, there were rose-colored curtains. There were rose-colored lamps. So actually the room itself was sort of submerged with a rose-colored light, which meant that that was Miss Emily's secret. Right? This is pretty cool. It's pretty cool. Faulkner's pretty much a genius. So I hope you guys enjoyed that. I hope it helped you to understand the story a bit. Okie dokie.